Well, hello, I'm Josh, and it's that time of year again, so I'm back with some more great spooky movies for you to watch this Halloween. And so I'm kicking us off with one of my favorites, a film that essentially started its own subgenre of psychological horror films. That being the Val Lewton classic directed by Jacques Tourneur, Cat People. Made in 1942, Cat People follows an American named Oliver Reed, who meets a Serbian immigrant, Irina, at the zoo. The two quickly fall in love and get married, appearing to be the perfect couple. However, all is not as great as it seems to be on the surface, as Irina begins to fear more and more the stories from her homeland of the mysterious cat people, and begins to worry that she too may become one. Now, as I said, this was a film directed by Jacques Tourneur, but it is also very closely associated with the movie's producer, Val Lewton. And if you have watched any of these Halloween videos that I do every year, you may have heard that name come up a time or two before. In fact, my best performing video in this series was on Night of the Demon, another film by Tourneur that, despite being made over 15 years after Cat People, incorporates many of the same techniques he developed and used while working on these films with Val Lewton. You see, Val Lewton had a deep love for literature and psychology. At a young age, he started writing anything he could get published, eventually working his way up the ranks to becoming writer and story editor for producer David O. Selznick at MGM. He even did some uncredited work on Gone with the Wind, writing the now famous scene at the Atlanta Depot. But after several years, he left Selznick to head up a new unit developing B-movies at RKO Studios. Now, RKO had recently found themselves in some financial woes after producing Orson Welles' first two films, Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, as despite them being both well regarded critically, financially they did not recuperate the massive budgets that were spent on them. So to fix this problem, the newly appointed VP decided that they needed to make some money fast, and what better way of doing so than by pumping out a few cheap horror flicks. And so Val Lewton was given the opportunity to cut his producing teeth on a project that was about as artistically low stakes as you could imagine. So low in fact that there was not even a script when he signed on to do it, just the title Cat People. RKO clearly wasn't aiming for any awards with this one. I mean, you can practically imagine the goofy humanoid looking cat costumes already. But as long as the kids showed up and paid for a ticket, I don't think RKO really would have cared either way. But Val Lewton didn't just want to make movies, he wanted to make great films that he would actually want to see himself. And so alongside his director Jacques Tourneur, Lewton developed a series of rules and principles for making these horror films. The technique Cat People relies most famously on being its use of darkness. The two quickly decided that the costume cats were not the way to go and found that often a scene could be even scarier without showing the creature at all. Using shadows in strategic ways, they could subconsciously guide the audience to lean in and letting their imaginations fill in the blanks left on screen. Nowadays, you can argue that horror films rely almost entirely on music and sound effects, but if you watch any of the early monster movies before this, like Dracula and Frankenstein, you'll find there are huge gaps without any music or dialogue at all. And though the use of sound had certainly developed over the next 10 years that followed, Val Lewton is generally regarded as being the first to really utilize sound design as another level in which he could enhance the film's scares, and even create new ones along the way. Now, I've talked about this before in other videos, but one of the earliest examples of a true jump scare comes from this film, Cat People. As we follow the character Alice walking down the sidewalk, she begins to get the feeling that she is not alone. We strain to hear the footsteps following her when we are jolted out of our seats by the sound of the bus rolling up and opening its doors. And by deconstructing this scene, you can see just how Tourneur was able to pull off this scare. As we watch both women one after the other walk in and out of the shadows, a rhythm is created which the audience is able to tune into. Tourneur uses the rhythm to set up expectations which he quickly subverts by, instead of cutting, letting the shot hold as Alice leaves the frame. We expect to see Irina following close behind, but instead the frame remains empty, immediately creating a sense of unease in the audience as we no longer know where the threat is, though we are certain it's still there. And they build on this more and more until we hear the sound of a roar quickly drowned out by an approaching bus, effectively creating one of the first jump scares in film history. And this scene became so iconic that for a long time afterwards, these sorts of jump scares were often referred to as the Lewton bus, somewhat like how the push-pull zoom trick is often referred to as the vertigo shot. Another iconic scene takes place at the indoor swimming pool where Alice is swimming by herself after hours. She hears the door, but it's too dark to see if anyone actually came in. The only sound we hear is the water rippling as she scans the room. Then we just hear the sound of a cat. Once again, the horror is built almost entirely around what we don't see rather than what we do. We can make out shadows moving past as the light reflects off the water, creating this fantastic and eerie shimmering effect on the walls. This scene is so well crafted, in fact, that it was practically lifted shot for shot for the 1982 remake. But along with the scares, the script penned by Duet Bodine is also surprisingly very well crafted for a B horror film like this. It may not be immediately noticeable, but if you watch a lot of horror films from this period like I do, you will definitely get the sense that there is something very different about the script here. Some of the characters just speak very strangely, almost dreamlike, and the caretaker at the zoo even quotes Revelation, building up this uneasy feeling of dread. But Bodine also delves into each of the characters' psychology throughout the film, something practically unheard of for a B horror movie, much less one with the name Cat People. And so even without the scares, the film still works pretty well as a solid drama. And the lighting and production design is also surprisingly great for a film like this. Much like the filmmakers I talked about in my video on Reign of Terror, Lewton found ways to repurpose sets as much as possible, and used heavy shadows to not only cloak the scene in a sense of mystery, but also simply just mask where the set dressing was not as complete. In fact, if you look at some of the bigger RKO movies from the time, you may just notice some very familiar looking scenery in this film. So when it came out, Cat People first opened on a double bill with the film Gorilla Man on Christmas Day, but it quickly gained critical attention upon its release. Lewton's old boss David O. Selznick even wrote him a letter of congratulations, telling him that his film was in every way a much better picture than 90% of the A product that he had seen in recent months. And with the film earning back $4 million on a budget of $135,000, Cat People not only became a great Hollywood success story, but a jumping off point for Lewton and his fellow creators in the years to come. You can even see the behind-the-scenes genesis of this film retold as part of Vincent Minnelli's backstage Hollywood classic The Bad and the Beautiful, which actually released the year after Lewton died from a heart attack at the young age of 46. So though Lewton's career as a movie producer was relatively short-lived, his impact on the horror genre and even the movie business as a whole would continue to show decades later. As I hinted at earlier, writer and director Paul Schrader would even go on to make his own off-the-wall remake of this film 40 years later in 1982. But further than that, you can see many of the principles first set in this film borrowed and built upon in many of the great horror films that followed it. As I said, I've even talked about a number of these films myself, including Night of the Demon, The Innocents, The Haunting, Diabolique, and the others. In fact, many of these principles have become so ingrained in the horror genre that I think it's pretty safe to say most people don't even realize that this is where they came from in the first place. I think that has a lot to do with the fact that at the end of the day, these films are very old B movies with crazy titles, and so they don't really fit into the prestigious elevated horror films that I think a lot of people would prefer to cite. But nevertheless, I find these Val Lewton films just fascinating to watch, and I appreciate them not only for the resourcefulness of the filmmaking, but they're also just really well made films. As much as I love watching the big studio movies with their slick production values and incredible attention to detail, for someone who also enjoys making films from time to time, I actually find it more inspiring and much more useful to study movies like these. You can break down their techniques fairly easily, and their tricks tend to be much more doable on a low budget, so you can really treat it like a film school if you want to. And just looking at the filmmakers involved in the various Val Lewton documentaries that have come out over the years, you can see that many people have. So if you like the Watch Cat people, it's fairly easy to track down. It's available to rent or buy streaming at all the usual places online, and I think it's also been uploaded to the Internet Archive if you want to check it out there for free. Otherwise, you can get it physically from a very nice restoration by Criterion. And this is a great one, like I said, if you want to learn from it, as there are some great bonus features included on the disc, including that documentary on Val Lewton I mentioned, which is actually narrated by Martin Scorsese, so that's pretty cool. But now for my comment question, I am wondering, what is your favorite low-budget horror film? I talked about a couple of them here over the years, such as Night of the Living Dead, Carnival of Souls, and even Psycho was considered low budget when it came out, even though it was made by Alfred Hitchcock. But really, I just find these films fascinating to watch, and just to see what qualities the filmmakers bring to them that you frankly just don't really see with the more polished Hollywood blockbusters. So go ahead and put your favorites in the comment section down below and start discussing. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you want to see some more of these. Remember to keep watching movies, and I will see you again soon.